Another day, another story. Since its debut in 1947, the clock's minute hand has indicated the potential for global destruction, or world peace. Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel. 1. 3 minutes to midnight. As the arms race gets underway, the clock hand inches forward in November 1949. When the Doomsday Clock debuted in 1947 as a cover design for the new magazine version of the newsletter-style Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the clock hand stood at 7 minutes to midnight, indicating an urgent public threat from nuclear technology. The hand's position remained static until President Harry Truman confirmed in late 1949 that the Soviet Union had tested a nuclear device, thereby starting a global arms race. The BAS then hit upon the idea to use the clock as a real-time tool to inform the public about the state of global security. The scientists who came up with the idea of moving the clock's hand had forecast an arms race back in 1945, said Kenneth Benedict, executive director of the BAS. They decided to move the hand forward as a way to sort of say, here we go. The clock has been a powerful symbol ever since. In 1949, the decision to set the Doomsday Clock at 3 minutes to midnight was a response to the Soviet Union's first successful test of a nuclear weapon. This event marked a significant escalation in the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, heightening global tensions during the early years of the Cold War. The development of nuclear weapons by the Soviet Union shattered the US monopoly on atomic capabilities and raised the stakes of potential global conflict. The decision to move the clock to 3 minutes to midnight underscored the perceived threat of nuclear war and the urgency of addressing the geopolitical and security challenges of the time. This adjustment of the Doomsday Clock reflected the palpable fear among scientists and the public about the destructive power of nuclear weapons and the potential for a devastating global conflict. The symbolic representation of the clock served as a visual and symbolic warning, emphasizing the need for international cooperation to prevent the unthinkable. 2 minutes to midnight. In September 1953, at the height of the Cold War, the world moves closer to its demise. The Doomsday Clock's minute hand nearly brushed midnight in September 1953. The move happened after the United States and the Soviet Union each tested a thermonuclear device within a 9-month span. This demonstrated an acceleration of the arms race, said Benedict, and there was no communication between the two countries at all, even behind the scenes. It remains the closest the hand has ever stood to midnight. In 1953, the decision to set the Doomsday Clock at 2 minutes to midnight was a response to a series of alarming events during the early years of the Cold War. This setting, at 2 minutes to midnight, remains the closest the clock has ever been to symbolic global catastrophe. Several factors contributed to this adjustment. Hydrogen bomb testing. Both the United States and the Soviet Union conducted successful tests of hydrogen bombs in 1952. The hydrogen bomb, or thermonuclear bomb, is significantly more powerful than atomic bombs, and the successful testing by both superpowers escalated the arms race to new and dangerous levels. Geopolitical tensions. The broader geopolitical landscape was marked by intense rivalry and distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was at its height, with both superpowers engaged in an ideological and strategic struggle for global influence. Arms race intensification. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union was accelerating, with both nations rapidly expanding their nuclear arsenals. This arms buildup heightened the risk of a catastrophic nuclear conflict. In response to these developments, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which oversees the Doomsday Clock, made the unprecedented move of setting the clock at 2 minutes to midnight in 1953. This decision underscored the organization's grave concerns about the heightened risk of nuclear war and the urgent need for diplomatic efforts to reduce tensions and promote disarmament. The 1953 setting serves as a stark reminder of one of the most perilous periods in modern history, highlighting the very real and immediate threat of global catastrophe posed by the escalating arms race and geopolitical tensions of the time. 3. 12 minutes to midnight. In October 1963, as the nuclear arms race eases, the clock hand backs away from doomsday. To de-escalate the arms race and reduce the effects of excessive nuclear fallout on the environment, leaders from the three major nuclear powers, the United States, Great Britain and the Soviet Union, signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited above-ground nuclear testing, in August 1963. In response, the doomsday clock's hand moved comfortably away from midnight, conveying the bulletin's increased optimism. 7 minutes to midnight. As more nations enter the arms race and war rages around the world, the clock hand inches closer to midnight in January 1968. With China and France obtaining nuclear capabilities, the US war in Vietnam escalating, India and Pakistan at odds and renewed hostilities in the Middle East, the BAS lamented the state of global security by moving the doomsday clock hand forward to ring in January 1968. There is little reason to feel sanguine about the future of our society on the world scale, the Bulletin proclaimed at the time. The decision to set the doomsday clock at 7 minutes to midnight in January 1968 was influenced by a combination of factors, reflecting the complex geopolitical landscape and escalating global tensions at that time. The setting of the clock is a subjective decision made by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, taking into account various political, military, and environmental factors. Here are some of the key elements that contributed to the setting of the clock in 1968. Nuclear proliferation. During this period, more nations were acquiring nuclear capabilities, contributing to the expansion of the global nuclear club. The spread of nuclear weapons raised concerns about the potential for regional conflicts and the increased risk of nuclear warfare. Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was in full swing in the late 1960s, and it was a major source of global conflict. The war heightened Cold War tensions, and the use of conventional and unconventional military strategies added to the overall sense of instability. Arms race intensification. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union continued to escalate. Both superpowers were actively building up their nuclear arsenals, and technological advancements in weapons systems increased the destructive potential of these arsenals. Political tensions. The late 1960s were marked by political unrest and social movements around the world. The Cold War rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union contributed to a polarized international environment, and various regional conflicts added to the overall sense of insecurity. Global instability. Beyond the nuclear realm, there were concerns about general global instability, including political and economic challenges that could potentially lead to conflict. In response to these factors, the decision-makers at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists adjusted the doomsday clock to 7 minutes to midnight in 1968, signaling an increased perception of the risk of global catastrophe. The symbolic setting of the clock was intended to raise awareness about the pressing need for international cooperation, arms control, and diplomatic efforts to address the multiple challenges facing the world during that tumultuous period. 3 minutes to midnight. In January 1984, the doomsday clock's hand creeps close to midnight as the two superpowers stop talking. After a decade of relative arms stability, the Cold War reached new heights between 1980 and 1983 as the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the United States pulled out of the Moscow Olympics, and communication between the two superpowers all but ceased. The Bulletin took these as ominous signs and advanced the doomsday clock hand as close to midnight as it had stood since the arms race began in 1949. 17 minutes to midnight. With the Cold War over, in December 1991 the clock's hand retreats far from the midnight of humankind's destruction. Following the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent breakup of the Soviet Union, in 1991 the BAS took the exceptional step of holding a public symposium to discuss the meaning of these events and invite discussion about the state of global security in the aftermath of the Cold War. This was a time they literally went off the charts in debating the position of the doomsday clock hand, Benedict said. Finally, in December 1991, After the United States and Russia signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty and began slashing their nuclear arsenals, the Bulletin moved the clock hand 17 minutes away from midnight to reflect this unprecedented moment of peace and cooperation between the superpowers. In 1991, the end of the Cold War marked a significant turning point in global geopolitics, and it had an impact on the setting of the Doomsday Clock. As the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union came to an end, there was a palpable sense of optimism and a reduction in the risk of nuclear conflict. This positive shift was reflected in the adjustment of the Doomsday Clock. The major event influencing this change was the signing of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, between the United States and the Soviet Union. The treaty, signed on July 31, 1991, was a historic agreement that aimed to reduce both nations' stockpiles of strategic nuclear weapons. It marked a significant step toward nuclear disarmament and was a product of the changing political climate as the Cold War tensions thawed. In recognition of this progress and the overall improvement in international relations, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the Doomsday Clock back. In 1991, the clock was set to 17 minutes to midnight, signifying a lessened perception of the immediate threat of global catastrophe. The adjustment in 1991 symbolized the hope for a more stable and secure world as the superpowers took steps to reduce their nuclear arsenals and improve diplomatic relations. While the end of the Cold War did not eliminate all global security threats, it marked a period of decreased nuclear tension and paved the way for further arms control agreements in the following years. 5 minutes to midnight, expanded to include threats from climate change and emerging technologies, the Doomsday Clock reflects urgent danger to civilization in January 2012. In 2007, the BAS broadened the scope of threats represented by the Doomsday Clock to include not only nuclear weapons but nuclear energy, climate change and technologies not created with malice aforethought, like synthetic biology, but technologies that nonetheless could spell doom for civilization today, Benedict said. In placing the clock hand at 5 minutes to midnight in January 2012, the Bulletin cited clear and present dangers of nuclear proliferation and climate change as the motivation behind the move toward doomsday. These moments in the history of the Doomsday Clock highlight the ebb and flow of global tensions, geopolitical events, and the evolving understanding of threats to humanity. The clock serves as a symbolic reminder of the need for concerted efforts to address existential risks and work towards a safer world. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.